Well, shalom, shalom, beloved viewers and subscribers. We're here again, the Natsurim of Yahuwah, and this is lesson 2 in our wealth slash resource slash financial stewardship series. And of course, I did promise that in the next lesson we would commence looking at the Asaf and Sarafa effects. However, it was absolutely important that I did this particular topic as lesson 2, looking at currency, empire, and power. And of course, we're doing a Hebraic analysis of modern monetary hegemony. I would encourage you to have something to take notes even after the presentation. I'm thinking some persons may want to go over the video and take some more notes. Nevertheless, we're excited to get into this particular lesson as we're looking at empires and how money is used as a tool of control and how it links scripturally, and how do we respond in the scattering? How do we respond? How do we prepare for what has already begun? And also what is to come. So let's begin, Yada Yahuwah. So we look at money as covenant and not convenience. Now, in Abri thought, money is never morally neutral. It functions as a covenantal instrument. And some of what I'm going to say throughout this presentation, I would have said in the previous presentation. The introduction to resource or wealth stewardship. So money is a covenantal instrument which encompasses a system of trust, obligation, and power. Now, throughout scripture, economic arrangements are inseparable from fairness, sovereignty, and violence. Modern earthwide finance, though secularized in language, follows the same ancient patterns observed in systems such as Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome. And the common thread we see coming out with debt, DEBT, being increased over a population. And Shalum 22 verse 7 says, the borrower is servant to the lender. So this axiom is not metaphorical, it's geopolitical. So it goes across territories and across governing structures. So first we will look at the post-gold dollar and the birth of monetary power. Now, in 1971, the United States, or we'll say USA, formally abandoned the Bretton Woods system by ending the dollar's convertibility into gold. This decision severed currency from tangible restraint and transformed the dollar into a fiat instrument not backed by weight, but by state credibility. So we would understand that in the past, um, gold, in fact, anything else that was considered money, rarely followed the pattern of weights and scales. Um, and so, even at one point, there were those who were paid using salt, and it's from the same word you get salary, but it was by weight. So, similar to how gold would have been by weight, or weight and scales, money in general was by weight and scales. So you can understand when the scripture speaks of unfair balances, unfair weights. You're talking about unfair payments, unfair charges. Um, Now, so this particular system was replaced by state credibility. So, in essence, looking at the integrity of the state, promises. So it is as though money became a promise. Um, and so for many of us who work, it is as though you're working for promises, right? Now, historically, fiat currencies collapse unless paired with external compulsion. The dollar did not collapse because in 1974, the United States negotiated a strategic agreement with Saudi Arabia. And this included Saudi oil would be sold exclusively in USA dollars. Um, and the US would provide military protection and regime security. Now, this agreement established what is now known as the petrodollar system. From that moment forward, all energy importing nations required dollars. Earthwide demand for dollars became permanent. USA's debt could expand without immediate domestic inflation. This was not market economics. I dare say this was empire economics. And we see in Daniel 7, it says, they rule over you, but not by righteousness. So there's an implicit pattern there. So the petrodollar as a system of enforcement. Now, the petrodollar system functions on three pillars. One, energy pricing in dollars. Two, military enforcement of trade routes and regimes. Three, financial infrastructure control, which means banks, clearing systems, and what is known as SWIFT. And we'll look a little bit at SWIFT further down. Now, the common thought is, or the common understanding is, when nations comply with the dollar system, they are integrated. When nations resist, they are isolated. This mirrors the ancient imperial model described in Daniel chapters 2 and 7. Economic dominance precedes political submission. So we look at sanctions as modern siege warfare. So uh, the more things change, the more they remain the same. So there are some things that, though they may have changed in method, the what is actually being done remains the same. Siege warfare. Now, in biblical warfare, sieges targeted supply lines, food access, and trade routes. So they would capture these particular territories and these particular items um, so they could control these areas, whether they're controlling your food, controlling your access to food, or controlling routes where trade would take place. Now, modern sanctions operate identically, but without armies at the gate. So, what do they use? Countries attempting to bypass dollar based settlement systems have faced these particular gatekeepers: swift exclusion, asset freezes, trade embargoes, secondary sanctions. Look at some examples. Um, in Iran, the oil trade alternatives, Russia with the non dollar energy settlements, Venezuela with the commodity pricing independence, Cuba financial isolation. Um, so SWIFT is not neutral, it is imperial infrastructure. And in Chazun 18 verse 13 says they buy and sell the beings of men. This is economic language, not simply a metaphor. So there is nothing new under the great light, right? Empires have cycles, or they are cyclical, and certain historical patterns are repeated. So in this little table, you see where history reveals a consistent sequence. And the sequence follows this: a currency becomes geopolitically dominant, military power enforces trust, debt expands beyond productivity, then you have alternatives emerging, then you have enforcement costs exceeding the returns, currency credibility erodes, and the empire contracts. And this has happened with the Dutch guilder, the British pound, and of course earlier Roman coinage debasement. Britain lost reserve status after World War II. Now, someone may be wondering, what is reserve status? Um, okay, so when a currency is the reserve, in the very simplest terms, it is the dollar, or the currency in which countries across the face of the earth trade in. So this is the currency that everybody recognizes, or most countries recognize. And in this case, or at this time, that would be the US dollar. Most countries across the face of the earth trade or do business across territories, across countries, with the dominant US dollar. But there was a time when the Dutch guilder held that status, the British pound held that status, and in earlier times, Roman coinage would have done so. So Britain lost reserve status after World War II. Within decades, the British Empire dissolved. So one of the other things that tends to happen in this pattern is that wars would happen that would also change the currency reserve status. So a new currency would tend to arise, or if the ruling powers for that currency were able to put in systems to preserve their status, even if by certain regulatory enforcements, they would do so, or even by force if they have to. Emerging alternatives and late stage indicators. Now, current developments align with late empire markers. There is rising sovereign debt, currency dilution, military overextension. There are parallel trade systems, so we know of the BRICS and the yuan based trade and bilateral settlements. Um, Infrastructure diplomacy, such as Belt and Road by China. These are not alliances of friendship, but they exist as exit strategies from dependency on a particular system. So they come together, in essence, to break free from USA's dollar. Yashayahu 8:10 says they seek counsel, but it shall not stand. Now, someone may be wondering what is the Belt and Road Initiative, which was mentioned. What is this Belt and Road? Um, so, Belt and Road is an earthwide infrastructure and trade strategy led by China, which was launched in 2013. It is China's plan to one, build roads, railways, ports, pipelines, um, power plants, and digital networks. Two, to connect Asia, Africa, Europe, and parts of Latin America. And three, make it easier to trade goods, move energy, and expand influence. Why is it called Belt and Road? Well, Belt stands for land routes, such as the railways, the roadways, that are in existence across territories, such as Asia and Europe, or Asia into Europe, similar to the ancient Silk Road. And road equals sea routes. Isn't that interesting? So belt equals land routes, and road means the sea routes or the routes by sea. So shipping lanes, or regular shipping routes, um, through the Indian Ocean, the Red Sea, the Mediterranean. Why is China doing this? So they aim to, one, secure trade routes for goods and energy. Trade routes are very critical, from ancient times until now. Secure trade routes for goods and energy. Increase the use of the Chinese yuan instead of USA's dollar. Gain political influence in developing nations. Reduce dependence on Western controlled systems. Now, some countries take large loans and struggle to repay, and this is called debt diplomacy. Strategic assets, such as ports and land, can end up under Chinese control. And depending on where you are in the world, you can think of this in the context of that specific country. Outside of USA's territory, if you can think of other countries, there are countries in the Caribbean who are pretty much in this spot right now. Um, Earlier I mentioned SWIFT. What is SWIFT? Now, SWIFT stands for Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication. What it actually does. So, SWIFT is not money and it's not a bank. It's like a secure messaging system that is used by banks across the Arats to tell each other who is sending money, who is receiving it, how much, and in which currency. So think of SWIFT as an earthwide banking email system. Um, so you can communicate, your bank can communicate with banks across different countries through this system. So what does it mean if a country doesn't have SWIFT or have access to SWIFT? Well, international payments will either become slow, expensive, or altogether impossible. Who controls SWIFT? Well, SWIFT is based in Belgium, and it is strongly influenced by Western governments, especially the US and the European Union. Why is SWIFT powerful? Well, if a country is cut off from SWIFT, it becomes almost isolated financially. Now, remember everything that I'm saying, think of it in the different contexts you're exposed to or you know of, whether it is the country you are or another country that you've heard of. For example, Russia was partially removed from SWIFT after the Ukraine conflict, and this severely affected its ability to trade with other territories internationally. So, you recognize, as I said before, that it wasn't the military used to go on a specific trade route, but it's now systems that are placed as gatekeepers, and one such system is SWIFT. So, how Belt and Road and SWIFT are connected, looking at the bigger picture. So, uh, China's long-term goal includes reducing reliance on SWIFT, creating alternative payment systems such as China's CIPS or cross-border interbank payment system, encouraging countries in Belt and Road to trade in using the yuan, the Chinese yuan, and using non-Western systems. So in short, SWIFT is a Western-controlled financial highway, and Belt and Road, China is building alternative trade highways. So different systems, but pretty much similar in that, it's control of particular trade that's happening. So let's do a Hebraic ethical assessment, because when we're looking at finance through Hebraic lenses or Abri thinking, we must ensure that we do an ethical assessment of that which we're looking at. So from a Torah perspective, any system that relies on unequal weights, and remember we're saying originally money was measured by weights. So though that system was eventually changed into credibility and promises, there was a weight system to determine how much should be charged, how much should be paid out, how much should be received. But so look at the current system still under the baseline of weights, though it's not used now. That is still the system that exists. Charges, payments, what should be received. So any system that relies on unequal weights, unequal charges, unequal payments, unfair payouts, whatever the case may be, any system that enforces trade through violent means, any system that profits from perpetual debt. And remember, in our previous lesson, we looked at the fact that debt means bondage, based on its root word. Any system that masks coercion as moral virtue is already under right ruling. In Habakkuk 2 verses 16 to 17, it brings out the point, woe to him who increases what is not his. Will not your creditors rise suddenly? Now, this is not anti-military sentiment. It's anti-deception. So we're against deception. Scripture does not condemn defense. It condemns empires built on false balances or weights and blood secured wealth. So violent means of securing wealth. So let's take a look at these case studies. And I like to call them case studies. You can call them what you will. Um, but we're going to look at some situations. So we're doing case studies or situation analysis. So here we have cases or nations. We have the economic actions that were taken by these nations. We have the system that would have been challenged because of these actions these nations took or attempted to take. Um, we have enforcement mechanisms that were used to um, to prevent um, these nations from moving forward with whatever trade or other systems they wanted to enforce through their economic action. So someone enforced some mechanism to be like a gatekeeper, to stop it or to dismantle it or to reverse it or something. What was the outcome of this enforcement, and what sort of patterns are we seeing? So we have here, for example, Libya with Gaddafi. In that particular case, there was a proposal for gold-backed African dinar, Pan-African monetary bloc. What system was this challenging? The dollar and the euro's dominance. It was also challenging IMF or World Bank system, the system of imposing debt. Because if you're borrowing, that means you will be servant to the lender. What was enforced? Military intervention, regime destabilization, and asset seizure. What was the outcome? The regime collapsed. The currency project that was proposed was terminated, and the gold reserves were lost. What's the pattern alignment? Monetary independence leads to the removal of a regime. We get to Iran. What was the economic action Iran wanted to take or started to take? Well, oil trade outside USA's dollar. So they wanted to trade outside of the reserve currency. They wanted alternative settlement and to implement barter systems. This is ancient practice. Barter systems are not new, but they wanted to have that system implemented. What systems were being challenged by this decision? Dollar-based oil trade would be challenged, and the dependency on SWIFT. And remember, we spoke about what was SWIFT. What enforcement was put in place to prevent or dismantle this decision? Sanctions came against Iran, partial SWIFT exclusion, banking and shipping isolation. What was the outcome? The currency collapsed that Iran was proposing to use. There was inflation and constrained imports. What's the pattern alignment? Financial isolation leads to internal pressure. Then we look at the case of Russia. Their economic action, de-dollarization, an alternative to SWIFT, gold accumulation, ruble energy trade. What systems would be challenged by this economic action? Western financial clearing systems would be challenged, and of course the monopoly of the reserve currency would be challenged. What sort of enforcements were put in place when these actions were taken? Swift restrictions, reserve freezes, and trade sanctions. What was the outcome? Short-term shock and accelerated parallel systems such as the BRICS and so on. All of those were accelerated as a result of these enforcements. What's the pattern alignment? Sanctions lead to bifurcation of earthwide finance. We look at the case of Iraq with Saddam Hussein. What was the economic action taken? Oil sales shifted from US's dollar to the euro. What system was being challenged? The petrodollar system. What sort of enforcement mechanism was used to prevent or stop or dismantle this decision? Military invasion and regime overthrow. What was the outcome? The currency reverted to US's dollar, and that particular regime in Iraq ended. What's the pattern of alignment we see here? Currency deviation leads to forceful correction. Let's look at the case of Venezuela. The economic action taken: oil-backed digital currency. And of course, system bypass. What system would be challenged by this action? Dollar settlement and traditional banking rails. What was the enforcement mechanism put in place to stop, dismantle, prevent this action? Sanctions were put in place against Venezuela. Asset freezes, banking isolation. What was the outcome of these enforcements? Hyperinflation and economic collapse. What does this tell us? System exit attempt equals or leads to, rather than equals, it leads to implosion. So any attempt to exit the system will lead to implosion. Our final situation here: general sanctioned states. Economic action taken: attempts at monetary sovereignty. So there are some states or some countries that attempt to have sovereignty with their money. What system would be challenged or is challenged? Centralized earthwide financial architecture. What enforcement mechanisms are used? Payment denial, as well as increased insurance and shipping restrictions. What's the outcome? Trade paralysis and dependency on other states, or dependency on the system that is dominant. What pattern do we see here? Permissioned economy enforcement. So entities or countries that want to be free from the system, independent of the system, there is something that is put in place to block or stop or limit or restrict their ability to trade freely, because they must subscribe to the dominant system. So, what is the observation, or what are some of these observations based on the various cases, based on the various situations? Economic control precedes military action. We saw that in the case of Libya and Iraq. Financial isolation functions as siege warfare. We saw that in the case of Iran and Venezuela. Alternative systems trigger escalation. The case of Russia and Libya. Compliance enforced through access denial. All cases. Monetary sovereignty is the red line. So you cannot, as a country, try to be sovereign with your money and your trade without some sort of enforcement coming from the dominant system. So states that challenge the dominant financial infrastructure face coordinated economic exclusion or destabilization, demonstrating that modern sovereignty is conditional upon participation in centralized monetary systems. Economic control is not a new idea. Remember, in the earlier parts of this presentation, I would have emphasized that there is nothing new under the great light. I would have also emphasized that there are certain patterns that remain the same. Though the methods may change, the baseline remains the same. The thought behind it, the idea behind it, remains the same. So economic control is a biblical pattern. Scripture repeatedly shows that control over buying and selling is one of the financial levers of power used by various empires. Of course, a key foundational verse is Chazun, or Revelation 13 verses 16 to 17, that emphasizes, and he causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark, that no man might buy or sell save he that had the mark. This passage is not primarily about technology, but about authority, allegiance, and permission to participate in the economy. Now, in Scripture, control of trade equals control of living. When we look at the Farah effect, which I would have presented on in a different lesson or different presentation, Yusuf or Joseph in Matsurim or Egypt, looking across Barashit chapters 41 to 47, Pharaoh centralized grain. People could not eat unless they submitted to the system. Eventually, what happened? Money failed. That's the money of the people, of the Egyptian people, failed. Livestock failed. Land failed. And people became servants to the state, or servants of the state. The borrower becomes servant to the lender. In chapter 47, verse 25, the people, seemingly programmed or something, said, "You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my master, and we will be Pharaoh's servants." These were the same people who had their own land, who had their own livestock, who had money. And when all of that failed, they became servants to the state, to Pharaoh. Now, economic dependence produced political submission. Babylon or Babel is the archetype of trade control. Babylon is condemned not merely for idolatry, but for merchant power. In Chazun 18 verse 3 and also 18 verse 23, we see the merchants of the Arats are waxed rich through the power of her riotous living. Verse 23, for your merchants were the great men of the Arats, or the earth. In Abri thought, merchants are power brokers. Trade routes show authority. Currency reveals loyalty. Let's look at buying and selling as a covenantal issue. Now in Torah, economic participation was tied to covenant obedience. There was the observance of the Shabbat and the Shana Shamata, or the year of release. No buying or selling was to take place on the Shabbat, and debts were to be released in the 7th year. When Yisrael violated this, we see Uikada 23:33, I'll scatter you among the nations. So economic disobedience led to exile. Chazun 13 is about who grants permission. The beast system does not create value, it controls access. Remember earlier when we looked at the cases and we spoke about access, and even in the slides before when we're talking about access and the gatekeepers and the systems that are implemented to control access, for example SWIFT. Now the Greek poio used here in Chazun 13 causes. He causes. Poio implies administrative enforcement, not brute force. So, in other words, it means you may work, you may produce, but you may not transact unless approved. Remember those countries which tried to be sovereign? You know, what restrictions and insurance and all of those things were enforced. So this mirrors the implementation of licensure or licenses, sanctions, digital access permissions, financial blacklisting. Those are used to restrict or entirely disconnect or block trade or transactions, which means you're not able to benefit from the outside and in any way. Why do money systems matter more than armies? Now, scripture shows empires fall after trade collapses. We saw this in our study of Yachazakal in various chapters, but we're looking specifically at Tyre in chapter 27, which was a maritime trade empire, and it controlled the shipping routes, the commodities, and the ports. Yachazakal 28:16 says, by the multitude of your merchandise they have filled the midst of you with violence. So trade created dependence, then exploitation, then collapse. Dependence, then exploitation, then collapse. So the mark spoken of in Chazun is about ownership and allegiance. In Abri thought, the hand would symbolize whatever you do. So actions, work, um, behavior, what you do. Um, the forehead represents your thoughts, your allegiance, your loyalty, your obedience. So when scripture says that we must guard them, when scripture says we must bind the commands, the words, bind them as a sign on your hand. Whatever you do, whatever work you do, whatever actions you do must reflect them. Your thoughts, your allegiance, your obedience, your loyalty must be guarded by them. So bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. And this is coming out of the Shema, Dabarim 6 verse 8. Now, the beast system copies Torah language. So the issue is, who governs your labor? What you do, when you do it. Is your when you do it honoring the Shabbat, for example? You know, who authorizes your commerce? Who owns your productivity? So why does control come through peace and prosperity? Daniel 8 verse 25 says, by peace shall he destroy many. Economic systems promise stability. They promise inclusion. They promise ease of access. You know, everything will be easier. And they promise security, which is what so many people crave. They crave stability, inclusion, easier lives, and security. But scripture warns in 1 Thessalonians 5:3, when they shall say peace and safety, shalom, shalom, then sudden destruction. So why is this earthwide and not one nation? Because some, and even some in the awakening, are of the view that all of this is flowing or is controlled by one particular country. All of this is happening with one country. No, in Chazun 18:23, it says all nations were deceived by their sorceries. All nations. The Babylonian model, or the Babel model, or the Babel system is not a specific country. The Babel system permeates countries, permeates nations. It's a system. It's not a single nation. It's a system throughout nations. It's a system that controls nations. The Greek word for sorcery, pharmakia, implies manipulation, systemic deception, control through dependency. So, economic systems that centralize trust, remove local autonomy from the system, and punish non-compliance fit this pattern of pharmakia. Now, the called out are economically marginalized first. Scripture is explicit. In Matthew 24:9, it says, you shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. In Abrim, or Hebrews 11:37, they wandered, destitute, afflicted, tormented. Now, economic exclusion is not punishment, mashpakhah, it is preparation. What is Yahuwah's counter system? Scripture never promises protection from systems. It promises provision that doesn't rely on these systems. Because our provision comes from Yahuwah. Yada Yahuwah. Manna provided without currency. When you look at Eliyahu or Elijah, he was fed outside the economy. Yahuwah sent birds, fed him through a brook. The early believers shared and lacked nothing. In Habakkuk 2 verse 4, we are reminded. Yahuwah says, my righteous one shall live by steadfastness. Not by the system and dependence on the system. So we started to take a peek into the Babylonian economic system, but let's look a little deeper into it as a framework. So this is the framework for understanding modern financial empires. So let's look at briefly at the Babylonian economic system. So Babylon in scripture was more than a city. So it was not merely a geographic location. It is a repeatable system, meaning a civilizational model characterized by centralized power, monetary manipulation, militarized trade, and spiritual deception. These characteristics are repeatable. And if we just listened carefully to these characteristics, we recognize that exists in systems now. Yahu 51:7 tells us Babel was a golden cup in the hand of Yahuwah, making all the Arats drunk. The intoxication is economic as much as it is spiritual. Babylon's power is sustained by control of exchange and not merely by armies. Let's look at the economic signature of Babylon. Across scripture, Babylonian systems share consistent features, and we named some of the characteristics, but let's look at the features. We have centralized monetary authority. Remember, this is a framework for the modern systems. So as we're listening to the framework, we can think of modern systems that share these features. Centralized monetary authority. Babylon consolidates economic power into elite institutions that dictate value, that dictate access, that dictate who participates. Ayub or Job 22:6 says, you have taken pledges from your brother for nothing. This is not random unfairness. This is systemic extraction. Remember, money became a promise. So the system became an entity that exploits the dependence on it, because there is a centralized authority. In Babylon, There was trade without ethical restraint. Babylonian or Babel commerce prioritizes profit over covenantal responsibility. Chazun 18:23 says, your merchants were the great men of the Arats. So these were the elites. Merchant elites in the Babylonian system replaces elders and judges or shapatim. Economic power supplants moral authority. That's the Babylonian signature. Another economic signature of Babylon: debt as domination. Babylon does not conquer only with weapons, it conquers through obligation. And here is our recurring scripture again, Shalum 22:7. The borrower becomes servant to the lender. Debt is Babylon's preferred chain, as it is clean, legal, and bloodless. If the system can get us to be in bondage by owing them, by spending more than you earn on your credit cards, by taking massive loans that you cannot repay, that is a preferred method because it is easy to control the masses, to control a system, to control a territory, a country, a people who are indebted to you. So the signature, a part of the signature of Babylon, is to ensure that it conquers through debt, through bondage, through binding countries, territories, nations, people with loans, massive insurance schemes, and other schemes. That's what they are, schemes and plots, to bind and to ensure you are indebted to them. Now we look at false weights and fiat power. Now the Torah explicitly condemns monetary systems that lack honest weight. Hebraic 25:13 says, you shall not have in your bag different weights. You must not be unfair or deceptive. And we see the system has traits of deception. Everyone is not treated the same. Not all territories are treated the same. Not all people are treated the same. Look in the workplaces. Are everyone treated the same or fairly? Some people, you find that they place now in classes and classism and ranks and hierarchies. And who do you usually see at the bottom of all of that? Think about it. Think about the nation of people. Think about the background of the people, the race of people. Who are the people who are usually, across various systems, at the bottom of the so-called food chain? Now, a fiat system, meaning currency untethered from measurable restraint, mirrors Babylonian practice, or which mirrors Babylonian practice. You see, value is declared but not proven. Trust is enforced, not earned. And compliance is mandatory. You don't have a choice. Nebuchadnezzar's image in Daniel 2 is not merely political, it's monetary as well. Each empire debases what came before it. So you had gold replaced by silver, replaced by bronze, iron, and iron mixed with clay. This is a decline of integrity. A decline of integrity. We look at trade, violence, and peace. Still looking at the Babylonian economic framework. Babylon promises stability while exporting instability. So they say peace, peace when there is no peace. Yirmiyahu 6:14. What are some modern parallels? Stability operations, humanitarian interventions, rules-based international order, yet behind the language is economic enforcement. Babylon's peace is conditional. You want peace? Obey the system. You want peace? Use the currency. You want peace? Accept the terms. But you see, they use abstraction, so you don't see all of this coming out. And we'll talk about abstraction. But Chazun 18, the most explicit economic indictment, it's not symbolic fantasy, it's commercial autopsy. What are some key indicators? Verse 11 of chapter 18 tells us earthwide merchants mourn. It never told us that the sovereigns were the ones mourning, but the merchant elites. Verses 12-13 says trade goods are listed, not crimes or wrongs. Trade goods are listed. When you look in verse 13, human lives are named as commodities, similar to those who were enslaved. By your sorcery, by your deception, by your manipulation, all nations are deceived. So for those who are trying to escape particular countries going into another country, the system permeates it. Nonetheless, it's there. Earlier we mentioned the Greek pharmakia implies systemic deception. It's not about magic. Babylon deceives through financial complexity, through abstraction, through moral distance. And I mentioned abstraction earlier. And someone may be saying, what is abstraction? So, abstraction, in essence, is taking away, or rather taking something complicated and focusing on the main idea while ignoring details. So, abstraction in the Babylon system hides real control by turning real things into symbols, numbers, systems that are not readily recognizable by the average person. So let's look at a simple breakdown. In Babylon's economic system, work becomes a salary number. Food becomes a price. Land becomes a title. Debt becomes a contract. Life value becomes GDP. The average person doesn't understand these figures and contracts and what's GDP and all of that. So the system abstracts or removes reality so people don't see who controls what, don't see who benefits, don't feel the human cost. One clear example, instead of saying people are struggling to eat, Babylon's system may say inflation is at 8%. The average person doesn't know what that means. That is abstraction. So it removes faces, it removes pain, it removes responsibility, which are relatable to the average person. What are some examples of abstraction with money? Money becomes numbers on a screen, not food or labor. Debt becomes normal paperwork, and it's no longer presented as bondage. Prices rise, which leads to suffering, but it's called market adjustment. Complicated terms or complex terms. What are some examples in modern digital systems? Buying and selling are reduced to permissions in a software. Access to money is controlled by platforms and not people. Economic obedience is enforced through systems and not soldiers. Why is this deception? Because when things are abstract, harm feels normal, control feels neutral, obedience feels technical. People obey systems not realizing they are obeying masters. So abstraction in Babylon's framework equals hiding unfairness behind numbers, contracts, and systems so control looks and feels normal. All right, so that was abstraction. But let's continue with the lesson. So, military power is economic insurance. Babylon does not rely on consent, it relies on enforcement. Yeshayahu 47:10, you trusted in your wickedness. Your wisdom and your knowledge led you astray. Empires fund armies through currency privilege. In turn, armies protect currency dominance. That is why trade routes are militarized, energy corridors are strategic assets, financial infrastructure becomes a weapon. When scripture tells us in Chazun 18:4, come out of her, my people, lest you share in your wrongs, it is not just moral, it's economic. It's not just spiritual withdrawal, it's economic disentanglement. Hebraic separation includes refusal of dishonest gain, so we don't get involved in that. Limiting debt, so limiting bondage to lenders. Local resilience among us. Honest weights, so honest transactions. And community-based provision. Yisrael was commanded to live differently inside these empires, not only outside of them. So we live separated. Why Babylon always falls? Babylon collapses for the same reason every time. Debt exceeds productivity, and we looked at this earlier. Enforcement exceeds legitimacy. Currency exceeds trust. Daniel 5:27, you have weighed in the balance and found wanting. This is economic right ruling language. Babylon is not overthrown by righteousness alone, but by its own excess. Now, financial literacy is covenant steadfastness. To understand Babylonian systems is not to despair, but to discern or distinguish. Hebraic wisdom teaches Money reveals allegiance, or, who is um, dedicated to what or who. Trade reveals what is valued or values. Debt reveals hierarchy. The more you owe, the lower on the ranking system you are. That's why they talk about, for example, they will tell you of someone who is well known and speaks of their net worth. Net worth. The average person doesn't understand net worth. That's abstraction. So, in essence, what they're saying is, when all the debt, everything they owe, is removed from what they earn, what is left is this so-called net worth. So, if you were to try to apply that to yourself, look at what you earn and what you currently owe. If what you owe exceeds what you earn, then to the system, you ain't got no net worth. You're at a negative or minus something. If what you earn, when you take out what you owe and your expenses, whatever is left would be the system's definition of your so-called net worth. So if $1 is left, then that's what the system would dictate is your net worth, $1. Teaching finance without ethics is Babylonian, because we must ensure that we teach the honest, fair, covenant approach to finance in the awakening and among the people of the Most High. If we do not teach what is right, what is fair, when we're teaching finance, that's Babylonian. But teaching fairness, teaching about what is right, teaching about, balanced scales without teaching economics is incomplete. In other words, it's important to know how we function within the system without allegiance to the system, without losing our values to covenant, and remaining outside of their hierarchical structure, their classism, their ranking system. And they talk about the rich class and the poor class and the high society, and they rank. Now, again, Babylon is not one nation. It's a system. It's a way of organizing power. It rises wherever currency is detached from fairness, trade is enforced by violence, debt replaces covenant, truth is masked as complexity or abstraction. Scripture does not ask us to fear Babylon. It asks us to recognize it, resist its values, and prepare for its fall. Chazun 16:15, Baruch is the one who sees and keeps his garments, or Shamar, guards his garments. So, how do those of us in Yisrael, in the scattering, respond or prepare? And I palal that the battery will hold up, because I have nowhere to charge this laptop. But let's trust Yahuwah. So how do those of us in Yisrael in the scattering respond or prepare? Now, preparation in the scattering is not escape from systems, but a loyal walk within them without surrender of allegiance. Yisrael has always lived under various empires. Understand the scattering is a covenantal location, not a failure. In Oikara 26, verse 33, Yahuwah says, I will scatter you among the nations. But also, when you get down to verse 44, He says, yet for all that I will not cast them away. So, in Abri thought, scattering is disciplinary, not annihilative. Yahuwah governs his people inside foreign economies. Exile is where covenant fidelity is redefined. Where your level of integrity, fairness, trust is redefined. Thinking shift. Do not seek Babylon's approval. Irrespective of where you are, that system. Do not curse the exile. Learn how to separate even under foreign rule. We must all maintain dual competence without dual allegiance. So we must be competent irrespective of where we are, irrespective of what we do, but we're not, our allegiance is only to Yahuwah. Yusuf served Pharaoh but obeyed Yahuwah. Daniel served sovereigns but refused defilement. Nahamyahu worked in imperial courts while rebuilding Sion. Yaramyahu 29:7 tells us, seek the peace of the city where I have exiled you. Yet palal, or pray to Yahuwah for it, for in its peace you have peace. How do we apply this? So participate economically without surrendering your integrity and not surrendering your loyalty to Yahuwah's covenant either. Uphold the instructions, the Torah. When you work, trade, or plan, do so with chakmah. Do so wisely. Seek Yahuwah for chakmah, for wisdom in how you work, where you work, when you work. Well, we're already told when we work, so we know when we should not. Seek Yahuwah with who you do business. Refuse identity replacement, and we looked at this briefly in the previous lesson. Don't sell out. Remain loyal to Yahuwah. Detach identity from currency and systems. Hadabarim 8:17. You shall not say my power and my might or of my hand has gotten me this wealth. We must be reminded Yahuwah is the one who causes us as his people to have wealth. And what's the purpose of it? The wealth must meet covenant realities. It must sustain us and our families. It must honor Yahuwah. Wealth is a tool, not trust. Remember, systems rise and fall. Yahuwah lifts sovereigns, or kings as some know them, and he puts sovereigns down. But covenant endures. This guards against panic when systems begin to tighten and apply pressure. It's important that we build covenantal skill and not systemic dependence. When you look at the Torah precedent, every household of our ancestors knew agriculture, so they knew how to sustain themselves with their food. They knew animal care. They produced something tangible. Remember in the previous lesson we spoke about developing or learning skills that do not depend on someone else to hire you, that can stand on its own. So develop skills. Learn to plant something. Have a small garden. If you don't have the land, maybe you can do container gardening. Plant some food. If you rear animals, excellent. Sheep and lamb and goat and cattle. Shamut 20 verse 9. 6 yumim you labor. So we're working, with the exception of the Shabbat. We don't sit down and get lazy or laid back. So develop transferable skills. And remember, we want our skills to be multi-generational. Wealth should be multi-generational. Whether we acquire skills, land, whatever other assets, we must be able to pass them on to generations. Practical trades. Practical things that we can do with our hands and be sustained by them. Our trust and allegiance should not be to a system, but to Yahuwah. Obtain knowledge that survives system shifts. This is one of the reasons we do these particular lessons. And we trust you'll share it with as many people as possible in the awakening. Because the truth is, there are those in the awakening who want to hear of different things, but they don't want to hear about economics, which is so critical to what is happening now to our people and what is about to happen. Don't hoard things. We reserve some, similar to the Yusuf model, but we share some as well. Given to others who are in need once you're able to. Remember, the wealth we receive from Yahuwah must meet covenant realities, must sustain us, and must honor Yahuwah. Restore economic fellowship and not communalism. There was no needy among them, as is declared in Ma'asim or Acts 4:34. No needy, because everyone shared severally, took care of each other. We spoke of that. I spoke of that in the previous lesson. So this echoes Dabarim 15. So what's the Abri model? Mutual aid. If I help you, you help me. Voluntary support. Decentralized care. Not forced sharing. So you must be willing to do it. It's free will. Must be willing to do it. It's not forced. So I don't force you to give. Must be within you. You must desire to give. It's not a central authority controlling your resources outside of Yahuwah. There's no human central authority that controls your resources, because all resources flow from Yahuwah. And it's not ideological collectivism. This weakens economic coercion. In each of us, Yahuwah has placed something. And all of us coming together as pockets of communities, or pockets of gatherings, in the scattering, can go through without panic, without fear. Remember to guard the hand. Guard how you work. Guard your actions. Guard how you behave. Guard the forehead. Guard where your allegiance lies. Guard who you obey. Guard who you trust. Be careful of who you trust. Preparation is internal first. It is within us first. Refuse moral compromise for access. Do not compromise the covenant because you want to access trade. You want to access the system's luxuries. We must train our thoughts now and don't wait for crisis to do so. because we're not ignorant of Hashatan's devices. We're not ignorant of what the system of the beast is about, because Yahuwah tells us ahead of time. We're encouraged to learn to live with less without losing our gladness and shalom. Learn to live with less. Learn to live with what is necessary or needed to sustain. We don't need the flashy, flamboyant, excessive luxuries that so many in the world crave and go after. Hodabarim 8:3, man shall not live by bread alone. We live by steadfastness, our steadfast trust in Yahuwah. Yahuwah trained our ancestors with manna, with simplicity, and with daily trust, or trust each yom. Those unable to live simply are easiest to control. Those unable to live simply are easiest to control. We honor the Most High Yahuwah, and we trust Him to provide for us. We trust Him to provide the sustenance. And even as He has allowed us to obtain this information, to obtain da'at, to obtain chakmah, let us use it wisely. We do not fear. Don't be afraid because the system is tightening. It is a tool of control. And Yahuwah tells us in 2 Timothy 1:7, He has not given us a root of fear. Empires rely on urgency, panic, and scarcity narratives, talking about the scarcity of food and the scarcity of water and the scarcity of oxygen and everything just going down. But the called out operate in chakmah. We are people of wisdom. We're people of patience. We're people of obedience. We're people who trust Yahuwah each yom for our sustenance. We may not see where it is coming from, but Yahuwah always provides. Even by the hands of the Most High, we must be fed. Even if He commands birds to take food to us, we must be fed, we must be sustained, as long as we trust Yahuwah and our allegiance is to Him and the covenant. The pressures will mount. They will squeeze, they will try to squeeze us, but remain steadfast. In fact, I dare say, train yourself through fasting as well. So even in times when we may not immediately have access to food, or to a lot of it, we're still sustained, we're still able to go. Because we're not gluttonous, and we don't depend on the system to feed us. Know when to say no. Daniel 3 and 6, chapters 3 and 6. There was no rebellion, no violence, no compromise. Preparation includes accepting loss if obedience requires it. They declared, "We will not serve your mighty ones." No. No. We will not break covenant. No. I will not break the Shabbat to earn millions of dollars. No. I will not engage in unfair transactions, deceptive transactions, bribery. No. Know when to say no. Trust the promise to the scattered. Yirmiyahu 30:11. Though I make a full end of all nations, yet I will not make a full end of you. Preparation in the scattering is not stockpiles. It's not isolation from everyone and everything else, because we are to be a community. It's not fear-based readiness either. So it's not trying to be alone. It's not trying to have stockpiles. It's covenant loyalty, economic wisdom, communal care, skillfulness, and fearless obedience under pressure. Those in the scattering prepare not by escaping empires, but by living covenant loyal lives within them, refusing to exchange obedience for economic permission. Now here are some references for some of the information that was presented. There are those who may want to go and read up on some of these things. So some of these books, articles may be obtained through physical copies or online libraries. We're part of different online libraries, different literary works. So some of these you may obtain soft copy, some you may obtain physically. Nevertheless, these would help you to read deeper if you are so inclined to do. Yada Yahuwah, Tuda for listening.
We are the Nazarene of Yahuwah.
And of course, we say Akkad Ahaba, which means
One love.
And we thank all our viewers and subscribers, all the family of the Most High, for viewing today's presentation. So remember to smash that like button.
Subscribe to the channel.
And hit that notification bell so that you may be alerted every time we upload.